Chancellor Rishi Sunak delivered his 2021 budget on the 27th of October and predicted it would deliver a stronger economy for the British people, including stronger growth, better public finances, and better employment prospects. And he was very optimistic about the UK moving to a new economic model of higher wages and productivity. He also, so that was the boosterish part of his announcement. He also confirmed his commitment to fiscal prudence and tax cuts, despite putting taxes up. So critics focused on the cost of living implications, which are quite serious for a lot of low-income people, and lack of funding for provision of the green transition. Conservatives, on the other hand, criticised the level of government spending and the tax rises. So with these contradictory signals, we thought it'd be really nice to take our own look at what might happen next year. And we asked Andrew Smith, who is the Chief Economic Advisor to the Industry Forum, to review the proposals and give us some of his, to outline the factors which will impact the UK economy and the recovery, and give us some of his usual comments and interpretations. We've also asked economists Vicky Price and Kate Bell to add their comments and views before a general discussion and questions on the prospects. So Vicky Price is a Chief Economic Advisor and board member of the Centre for Economics and Business Research, CEBR. She also does many other things, which I'm not going to list now. And I have to confess that she's a long-term colleague of Andrew and I, and we had plenty of fun in the 80s and 90s doing bids when we worked for KPMG. When working for KPMG was still more respectable than being a politician or a journalist. Kate Bell is the head of the TUC's Rights International Social and Economics Department. There's a big scope, and she leads the TUC's work on boosting employment rights, promoting social and economic policies, and benefiting people and building international solidarity. So I'm going to ask Andrew, who's got a few slides, to speak for about 15 minutes, and then Vicky and Kate to comment and give us their views of the key issues for about 10 minutes. That'll leave us a bit of time for Q&A. So I'm handing over now to Andrew.
Okay, just share my screen, I hope. How are we doing?
Pretty good.
Is it shared?
Yep. It's not on full screen yet.
No. There we go. Okay. Well, thank you, Rod, and good morning, everybody. As some of you who know me will suspect, I've got too many slides with too many words on, so I'm going to dive straight in and edited highlights only. How's the economy doing? Well, if you go back to Plan A, to preserve as much of the economy as possible through the pandemic and the lockdowns, things actually have gone much better than I think most people expected 18 months ago. So in terms of GDP, we're not back quite to the peak, but we're pretty close. Employment is actually higher now than before the pandemic, although not such good news for the self-employed, but that's a rather different matter. But certainly payroll employment's been picking up pretty strongly, and unemployment low, of course. It hasn't cost the government, in inverted commas, as much as it thought it was going to only 6 months ago. And we've all got lots of cash built up in bank deposits and so forth, because we haven't been going out and spending it. The fly in the ointment, to some extent, is what's been happening with inflation. Now, so far, this is largely, I think, driven by commodity or energy oil prices. Since it's sort of supply side driven, raising interest rates doesn't, to me, make an awful lot of sense unless the bank's convinced it's about to spill over into big wage rises and so forth, and So personally, I would not be thinking about raising interest rates now, but of course the bank's another matter. Anyway, reasonably satisfactory performance so far through the pandemic and the big picture. Where do we go from here? Well, basically this year, this is one of the OBR's more interesting, i.e. odd sort of forecasts, I think. This year, it's looking quite good. So we've had a reasonably balanced recovery in a sense. Obviously, it's a bit of a mix-up. It's just rebounding. But you can see that consumer spending is reasonably strong through 2021, supported by government spending of various types. And in real terms, if you look at inflation at 2.3 and average earnings, again, a funny number, but nevertheless, if earnings are running faster than inflation, you've got a real increase for consumers to spend. This year, next year, they're forecasting a similar overall growth rate. If you look again at the inflation versus earnings, there's no improvement in their forecast. There's no growth in real wages at all. And yet they're forecasting a dramatic 10% rise effectively in household consumption. And that is all dependent. The only thing which is going to be driving that in the forecast must be running down those cash balances a lot of people have sitting in various deposits and so forth. So, as I say, a rather curious one. I don't know quite how they justified that. We might talk a bit about that later. Thereafter, everything kind of peters out and we revert to a fairly anemic, what they assume is some sort of long run trend growth rate, I guess. So that's where we are. The IMF put this in international terms, basically saying what was being forecast in 2019, i.e. pre-pandemic, for 2024, and what is being forecast now for 2024 for these countries. And the US is doing, or is expected now to do an awful lot better, despite the pandemic, than people were thinking 5 years ago. UK, on the other hand, is doing rather worse. Expected to do rather worse, and I think that's probably some extent baked in now, particularly against the US, obviously. Well, why might that be? Well, there's one obvious explanation. We're the only country to declare a trade war on ourselves, and we're also the only country knowingly to chop off a large labour market, which we'd been able to utilise up till now. So it's not surprising our prospects are pretty poor relatively. I'm not a great fan of scarring arguments, and I think it's too early to start comparing how much damage has been done to whom. You know, I think as far as I'm concerned, we're still mid-pandemic in many places. Nevertheless, you could argue that at certain points the UK's done worse in terms of control and so forth. Pretty unambiguous on fiscal policy. The US has gone pretty big and transferring lump sums direct to individuals. So, you know, basically people go out and spend it. UK has been much more, well, tax giveaways to companies, really. Whether that helps improve investment, who knows, doesn't normally. And of course, in the budget, we've got very welcome increases in departmental spending. But if you know, it's taking away with the other hand with these tax increases. So I would say that the risk is fiscal policy still being run too tight. And Sunak obviously preferred to talk about when he might be able to cut taxes rather than the fact he was raising them so much now. But on his own projections, you know, it just doesn't look like there's an awful lot of scope over the next few years. Or let's say there's a low chance that there'll be much scope to cut taxes, or cut taxes reasonably, shall we say. Can anything be done to change that outlook I've just described? Well, Johnson's got his own theory. It wasn't 25 years, it wasn't uncontrolled, and most surveys suggest that overseas workers are better skilled and actually contribute to raising productivity overall in the economy. Johnson seems to think that the way to get higher productivity is to raise wages. Well, the rest of us were thinking, gosh, it's the other way round, isn't it? And clearly there's a sort of risk. It's all right to raise small sectors' wages, which may or may not be justified by an improvement in productivity. But if you do that, start doing that across the board, you're just going to get costs going out of control, bad inflation, erode your competitiveness and growth. And we do know how to, or some extent, how do you go about getting a more skilled and more productive labour market. So maybe we ought to pursue some of those things. What about levelling up? Well, it means all things to all men. Theresa May talked about it in terms of education. Johnson tends to talk about it in terms of whatever his audience is. And it's quite ironic to me that the one thing the government is clear about, it is not about redistributing wealth. You can't make poor parts of the country richer by making rich parts poorer. Seems to be evidently untrue. I mean, you can certainly make poor people richer by making rich people poorer, which is what the whole tax and benefit system does. So that's not terribly impressive. And of course, all this is not new. I mean, we had the great Labour government's moves with the regional development agencies, which weren't perfect, but they were trying to do some form of improvement. And it's hard. I mean, it's a hard thing to do because firms like to cluster in already prosperous areas which have good educated labour and so forth. And you've got to, go out on a limb if you're going to go anywhere else, really. And it's also a bit bizarre that the government's failed to notice that there's already 45 enterprise zones in the economy, dating from Osborne's moves in 2011. I assume they can't have been very successful. The government might have noticed they were there. And there's a white paper promised on what levelling up is all about, and we'll find out, I guess, then. We've got building back better. It's another plan for growth. And that's to support growth through significant investment in infrastructure, skills and innovation, and to pursue growth that levels up every part of the UK, enables the transition to net zero and supports our vision for global Britain. I mean, what is not to like? There's a lot missing if you look at some of the stuff they've been talking about. And I find particularly curious, I don't find the emphasis on R&D and the government planning to support increases in research and development, which is, I think, pretty important. But it appears that the way they're going to decide who they're going to support is by looking at who's spending the money on R&D at the moment. And of course, it's chips, cars and software companies. And it appears that they're planning to put more money into those sectors, which is a bit bizarre because you'd have thought the companies are already doing optimal spending as far as they're concerned. So this is something where there doesn't appear to be a market failure to address, but the government seems to think it's an essential part of its policy. When I saw science superpower agenda phrase for the first time, I just assumed it was something Johnson had made up on the spot. I suppose it possibly is, but whatever it is, it doesn't appear that it's got off to a particularly good start in terms of attracting talent from overseas. So I'm very negative about all this, I'm afraid. I find it sort of not greatly detailed and difficult to completely swallow. What about deregulation, which of course was apparently one of the major benefits of leaving the EU? Well, the bad news for the government is someone's already been and done it before. So you had these big, huge changes in the economy and the way it worked under Thatcher, with the privatizations and free out movement of capital and so on. And that was a kind of big development. That the sort of stuff we're talking about now is just not in the same sort of league as that. I don't know much about digital markets particularly, but I'd have thought whatever we do, a lot of other countries will probably be doing the same sort of thing. it might be great. I don't know, but it's not, as I say, it's not the kind of scale of the big structural stuff. And when you think about it, opportunities for those sorts of changes don't come along every day. And just going back to, you know, the transformative waves we've had in history, things like railways, electricity, air travel, there's no real evidence that technological change now is on that sort of scale and that sort of a big game changer. And the American economist Robert Gordon, growth economist, basically says, do a thought experiment. You can either keep your mobile phone and have your running water taken away, or keep your running water and revert to a fixed line. What do you want to do? So that's his way of suggesting, well, maybe these things aren't as transformational as you think. And there's a general point I wanted to make, that a lot of this stuff, you know, well, it's obvious really, it requires you doing a lot of work. So if you want to establish yourself as some sort of global player in fast growing markets, you know, you ought to have teams of people out there working to establish relationships and all that stuff. When what have we done? Well, we've basically sort of downgraded DFID, and you know, it just doesn't seem to make that the actions don't match the ambition, shall we say. So where does that leave us? Well, the continuation of this strong recovery into this year, 6% again they're forecasting, is very much dependent on COVID not start raising its head again to deter people. The consumer, how much of their savings are consumers going to spend is actually quite a difficult question, because if windfalls theoretically shouldn't change spending patterns that much. And we know that one of the reasons that COVID was so potentially damaging was that a lot of our consumption these days is social consumption, where we go out, go to pubs, go to films, football matches, everything, and mix with other people, which of course is one of the things which has been more difficult to do, have haircuts and things. But of course, there's only so much catch up you can do to replace that spending when you can spend it again. You know, there's only so many extra meals out you might have, so many haircuts you can have, and so forth. So it's not obvious to me that there's going to be this huge rush to, you know, grow our spending by 10%. We'll see. There's a point about what should the policy mix be, and it seems fairly obvious that if interest rates are stuck around zero, they've lost their potency. And under those circumstances, you should be using fiscal policy to target growth. And if, particularly if the Bank of England's thinking of raising rates. So it seems to me that if we're not careful, we'll be doing exactly what we did in the austerity measure of just basically pinning output down, because we were tightening fiscal policy and the Bank of England couldn't really do anything about it apart from unconventional measures, which may or may not do very much and probably don't do very much. I've been pretty skeptical, but it seems fairly clear that, you know, just thinking somehow you're going to turn this economy into something completely different is clearly something which you shouldn't just believe as the truth. And civil servants will try, but I mean, is this government, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, really up to managing to develop anything coherent? I think it's very doubtful. And also, lest it's forgotten, this Brexit is going to continue to throw up difficulties. I mean, we still haven't really done anything about our borders and customs, so that's another big hurdle where we could fall proper again. Anyway, sorry to be so negative, but there we are.
Well, thanks a lot, Andrew. I think you've covered an enormous amount and raised really good issues. Now I'll hand over to Vicky to get some comments from Heathrow, I think.
Indeed, I'm at Heathrow, and I hope there isn't too much noise around this and you can hear me and see me okay. Just a few points. I always enjoy listening to Andrew. And as you rightly said, Rod, we used to work together. And of course, I agree with everything he says. I've always done. But I think some points to make and bring it perhaps into a slightly more international perspective. I mean, the interesting thing is that, yes, the papers are full today about how the COVID resurgence, if you like, in Europe is a serious problem, and how the UK is likely to be able to survive whatever is thrown at us this winter a bit better than others. But it is worth bearing in mind that in the third quarter of this year, the UK was still, if you look at the output GDP growth, some 2.3% below where we were pre-pandemic. That compares with just 0.2% for the Eurozone, below the pre-pandemic. Of course, there are huge variations that exist in the Eurozone. But nevertheless, if you look at the big countries, whether it's Germany and France, they are closer to getting back to normality. And we also had data from the Netherlands in the last quarter, which showed that, in fact, with a very substantial growth in Q3, they've ended up being above pre-pandemic level. So yes, there are issues in Europe. Yes, there are particular issues because of the lockdowns that are happening right now. And yet, if you saw the November PMI data, it just came out yesterday for Europe, it suggests that there's been quite a substantial pickup in business activity, which is interesting. It doesn't mean, of course, that everyone is happy. The consumer confidence indicators have taken a bit of a hit in Europe, and it's perfectly understandable, particularly if you have lockdowns again, and the future prospects don't look particularly good, even for business, if you look at the details of the PMI data. But nevertheless, what has happened through 2021, and I think to a considerable extent because of Brexit, but also the way in which policies have been instituted, a lot of uncertainty for businesses. We have had supply chain problems like everybody else, and price increases like everybody else, which have come from abroad, in the sense of, forgive me, I don't mean that they're coming from abroad. What I meant is that there are global trends that have hit us over which we had no control. They're sort of exogenous things that are happening. But of course, they're only exogenous in the sense that we haven't directly contributed to them, but we have, along everybody else, because we've increased demand so substantially worldwide after all these closures that happened in 2020, and supply hasn't been able to respond, and hence why we've had these very substantial increases in input costs to business, and why, of course, inflation is picking up everywhere. But the interesting thing is that the supply chain issues in the UK seem to be worse. If you just look at the latest PMI manufacturing survey, this is the Purchasing Managers Index, what you find is that if you look at new orders less inventory, what the UK has been worst hit of the Euro area overall, the US, and Japan, despite the fact they've all, of course, had problems. So there is something there which is deeper. And of course, it is being reflected up to a point in what manufacturing output is doing. We've seen manufacturing output plateauing in the UK in the last few months. Yes, of course, we've seen in Germany manufacturing output actually declining the odd month. But what the OECD is expecting and has been predicting for a while is that supply chain issues and price issues, inflation issues, are going to be more persistent and stronger in the UK than in other places. Now, how does it actually look at present from that point of view? And that, of course, is important for the interest rate discussion that Andrew raised. For the moment, although there's bound to be a further increase, the UK finds itself with an inflation rate of about 4%. The Eurozone as a whole is about the same, but there are some countries that are seeing expectations anyway of inflation rising to 6%. And I've just looked at some data or some forecasts for Germany that it may well hit 6%, the next data that we get. But what this suggests, unless we also move to suddenly 6%, is that overall, if you compare us also to the US, which is over 6% already, the inflation pressures are about the same, if you like, across Europe, even though there are huge differences between different countries in Europe, as I said before, not just in growth, but also in inflation. And yet we might end up, because of suggestions made by Andrew Bailey that were interpreted in the market in a certain way, because of pressures, therefore, that one has to do what you say, have an increase in interest rates happening before it happens in Europe and before it happens in the US. And one of the reasons why we have strengthened against the euro is because of that. That is an interesting and worrying phenomenon, that we're going to have an interest rate increase when perhaps you could argue that we're still in a phase where we need to watch the cost of businesses increasing, particularly when we're going to be having increases in taxes and so on. So that's one of the concerns, if you look ahead, that policy making is done in a slightly haphazard way, and lots of contradictory messages are being given that confuse the markets when they are. In the meantime, of course, yes, wages are going up, and therefore there is some concern about inflation, but the supply shortages, which are caused by Brexit, are unlikely to be eased through, or be really dealt with through tightening, as Andrew was saying, either fiscal or financial policies. They are now ingrained in the system, and we're having huge gaps in staffing, not only in hospitality, which of course is one of the worst hit, but interestingly, when you look at the way in which wages have gone up, you've got it in construction, where wages are actually rising at one of the fastest rates that we have seen for quite some time. But you've also got it, to my huge surprise, in the financial sector and the business sector more generally. So either there's a shortage of bankers, or they're really doing incredibly well out of the conditions that they're finding themselves in, with huge support from the government. So where do we go from here? I would focus just in my last few comments on international competitiveness for the UK. I already mentioned the concerns about our rates going up higher, what would happen to the exchange rate, which we actually need to be reasonably weak, I would guess, given that our trade position right now is not particularly good, and we've lost something like 15% of our trade to Europe so far. But there is an issue. Europe, because of Brexit, in a way, is getting closer together. Yes, there are problems with Poland and Hungary, and we've seen what's going on right now on the migration front. But think of the ways in which areas have changed and progress has changed. One is there is a bigger move towards a banking union. It's getting faster, and there's a lot of interest in attracting business from the UK. Second, we have a more integrated energy market developing. We have a more integrated digital market developing in Europe. We have also more integrated, general capital, a single capital market, which is being pushed quite aggressively, which will be actually, pretty good news in terms of raising money in Europe and being able to counter whatever the UK, perhaps through deregulation, as Andrew was mentioning, maybe can offer. And then, of course, you have a lot of concentrated investment that's going to be taking place on climate change, which, of course, leaves us with the amounts that we have been discussing seriously a poor third if you also look at what is planned in the US. And that's a worry in terms of looking ahead. And then the final point on how do we, in fact, spend our cash here in the UK. I couldn't agree more with what Andrew said about additionality. In other words, what do you need to do when you're spending money? First of all, of course, you have to be transparent as a government. And second, you have to have done your cost benefit properly. If leveling up is taking over in terms of investment decisions over the need to do proper cost benefit, then that is a worry in terms of where some of the money that is being spent on encouraging industry to invest and locate in those places is happening. And that will need to be looked at quite carefully. Of course, there may be some jobs that are being generated. The question, of course, is where those jobs are going to be generated anyway. And I will leave you with this leveling up thought. If you look at how spending has been taking place in transport across the UK, and of course, you've got the latest furor about the cut in HS2 routes and so on. But what you see is that the amount that's being spent per capita, was being spent per capita pre-pandemic in London on transport was £903. In the East Midlands, it was just 268. Yes, in the West Midlands, not so bad, 467, still half what it was in London. And what the Centre for Cities and others have calculated is that because of the pandemic and possibly Brexit, which is likely to leave a long-standing scarring effect, as the OBR is suggesting, the cost of levelling up has gone up 4 times. Where will this money be found? I'll leave you with the question mark there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vicky. Sounds like the next session should be on central bank policy. But anyway, that was really great, Vicky and Andrew. Now we'll slightly change the tone and talk to Kate. Give us a view about labour markets and labour conditions and things like that.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to get to listen to Andrew and Vicky, and I don't agree with everything they said, but I do agree with lots of it. So in the kind of brief for this, I was asked to talk about, what are the key issues for the UK economy? And I always like to have 3 issues, and my key issues for the UK economy next year are pay, pay and pay. I think this is going to be the critical kind of debate in economics, and in many ways the way that most people experience the economy is through their pay packet. When you talk about economic growth levels, if you talk about levelling up, if you talk about investment, for most people they're going to think, well, does it make me better off? And the critical factor that's going on there is going to be about their pay. And the reason why I think this is so important in the kind of post-pandemic context is the kind of longer context of that. We have the best quality pay data comes from a survey called the Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings, which came out in October, and that shows there's been no real pay growth, so pay after inflation's been taken into account, since 2009. Now that is a pretty incredible figure. Basically, people have not got anywhere better off for the past 12 years. And if we think about what is the point of economic growth, it's definitely to deliver improvements in living standards. We have not seen that. And that's why I think kind of the pay squeeze, sometimes talking about this, it all feels a bit kind of, 2013, when we were talking a lot about kind of cost of living crises. But I think it's kind of the critical issue going forward. And the prospects aren't much better either. In the Office for Budget Responsibilities economic forecasts until 2025, real pay growth is meant to be just 0.3% a year. We gave a kind of generous reading of the figures. The IFS basically said there'll be no real pay growth at all over this period. So we think when the Prime Minister says we want a high wage, high skill economy, he's talking about, the right problem. Whether he has the solutions is a very different matter. I just thought I'd talk a little bit about, so what factors are going to go into that kind of real pay squeeze, and what's contributing to it, and how might we change it? Well, like both Andrew and Vicky have talked about, inflation's obviously a big factor, and rises in the cost of living are kind of critical. I think our view also is that most of these are being caused by supply chain pressures, which are at least in part global, though, as I think Vicky said, affecting the UK in particular ways, and that interest rate rises would not be the right response, and might also harm kind of productive investment in the economy, which is absolutely what we need. But I think there's kind of an interesting question for us, which, I'm really interested in people's kind of thoughts about, is how much we kind of concentrate in our debate on what might be temporary increases in the cost of living, and how much we concentrate on kind of the broader underlying factors which are contributing to that kind of fall in the nominal rate of pay. And I think it's the inflation figures that will put kind of pay back in the headlines, but it might be those underlying factors that we actually want to concentrate on when we think about the policy response. Next kind of factor, I guess, when we're thinking about that policy response, is kind of the most obvious levers that government has. So those are the national minimum wage and public sector pay. That's where kind of government controls directly the pay of millions of workers across the economy. We did have a bit of better news around the budget on this. I'm sit on the Low Pay Commission, so obviously I think all our decisions are great, but the Low Pay Commission delivered the largest cash increase in the national living wage that's ever been. So the national living wage set to reach £9.50 in March next year, and that's part of the government's target for the national living wage to reach 2/3 of median earnings by 2025. I think, you know, the trade union movement believes there's definitely scope for more ambition in that space, but you are seeing the pay of the lowest paid actually holding up a bit better than the pay of most other people in the economy. And maybe some of the people who are feeling most that kind of squeeze are middle earners. The government also formally lifted its pay freeze in the public sector. So that will make a difference, but those pay settlements are set by kind of departmental negotiations and negotiations with pay review bodies, and we don't yet know whether they're really going to fund that, or if they're going to be saying, okay, those pay increases have to come from reductions in other forms of spending in public services. And that, of course, is a big factor, not only for those public sector workers, but also because the public sector can set pay expectations in the rest of the economy. And obviously we saw long freezes in the public sector pay over the 2010s. It's not yet clear whether they will continue throughout the 2020s. Of course, the level of economic growth is a big factor, and the level of productivity we're able to deliver has got this kind of circular relationship with pay. And here, kind of, you know, I think, as both Andrew and Vicky have said, the government doesn't really look like it's got a particularly coherent plan of how to deliver that growth and how to deliver it evenly across the economy. They're certainly not boosting it like Biden, which has been, you know, the kind of call from a lot of people in terms of kind of the level of investment that government might be putting in. Capital investment is growing from the government, but they've got this artificial cap, 3% cap on the level of government investment. And I think that may have been kind of influencing some of the decisions around HS2, which of course are holding back some of the regional connectivity issues, which have been identified as one of those causes of regional differences. I think although the government is talking quite a good game on the need to invest in kind of green technology, they are not putting the investment in that's needed. Pretty low levels of investment. There is now kind of a more coherent plan, but their collection of kind of economists more or less kind of on the left has suggested a level of 40 billion investment a year over the course of the Parliament as the level that would be necessary to transition us to net zero. Government's nowhere near that at the moment. And of course, that's an enormous missed opportunity to think about where our competitiveness could lie, what are the investments that would actually deliver that levelling up challenge, as well, of course, of the vital necessity of meeting that net zero target, because we know just how disruptive climate change will be to the economy. I guess the kind of third factor I wanted to talk about, though, and maybe where I disagree with Andrew a little bit, is there is a fact about, you know, when we're thinking about how we can raise pay, thinking about, do workers get their fair share of what we actually do produce? And when you look at kind of the long-term trends around this, we've seen that the wage share, so the proportion of every pound of economic product that's produced that goes to workers, has dramatically fallen over the past 30 years. And so these kind of pay squeezes are sometimes tracking our slow productivity growth, but they also reflect, you know, a change in the distribution of where our economic product has gone away from workers and towards capital, putting it clearly. And I think we probably do need to talk about that when we think about how might we sustainably increase pay. So yes, we absolutely need to increase productivity, we need to increase economic growth. And of course, there's some evidence of that wage-led productivity can also help. Lots of evidence that our kind of low skill, low rights, low pay employment model has held back productivity rather than enabled it. And fixing that, including giving workers more confidence by improving their employment rights, might help with that. But I think also, and you know, I work for the trade union movement, so we would think this, but giving workers more power to negotiate their pay and conditions would actually also play a significant impact in ensuring that pay can rise sustainably. And one of the really interesting things about the debate in labour shortages has been around labour shortages has both been, you know, that most of these are occurring in industries where pay and conditions have been raised for years. I saw an ex-colleague who's just retired yesterday, and he was telling me that when there were debates about abolishing the wage councils, logistics and haulage was actually one of the issues that came up as this is an area where we really need collective bargaining power in order to push up pay. And you'll know that unions have been raising issues in the logistics industry for years, resulting in the labour shortages we're seeing today. So I think there's a real kind of issue about how we have kind of sustainable increases in pay, but those, you know, part of that debate has to be about how workers get their fair share of any growth that we are able to produce. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kate. That was brilliant, and I think we've had 3 great presentations. And I think actually, if we sat down for an afternoon, we could actually reconcile the differences and come up with a decent economic plan and a growth plan. And it sounds as though that's exactly what the government should do as well, and what they're missing out. But anyway, I'm sure a few questions have arisen. I haven't seen anything on chat yet, but the audience is welcome to come back and ask questions of the panel. And if you haven't got questions, I have got a few that have bubbled up. Does anyone have a question? I mean, the first question to kick this off is, you know, I think Jürgen Mayer says the thing is, to have a thriving economy, you have to make things that people actually want rather than play around with tax rates and investment. And I wonder if the success of the US economy is actually down to the fact that the US is actually very dominant in tech. And, you know, these are the sort of things that people want. And they've even been very successful in the car industry, where Europe tended to lead with Tesla, etc. And they're leaping ahead in a whole range of technology industries. And perhaps Europe and all the rest of the world has got to think of some way of competing with that.
Can I come in really briefly on that? I just
sure.
was privileged to sit in on a really interesting discussion which made me think about this the other day, where someone was saying, you know, when we always talk about we want an economy that makes things, basically. And our economy is obviously, you know, it's a services dominated economy. And one thing I found really interesting about the discussion was someone was challenging that idea and saying, well, you make a TV program, you know, if you're an architect firm, your services, but you make something, basically. You know, lots of the creative industries in which the UK is reasonably strong involve making. It's just not making in the way that we often think of, you know, making cars, basically. So I think there is something about kind of making sure, that's a terrible, was not meant to be a pun, ensuring that we are conceptualizing, you know, we make sure that all jobs can be valued and can deliver the decent terms and conditions, which I think a lot of the kind of nostalgia, for want of a better word, around our manufacturing industries are actually about. You know, it's about the good jobs, not necessarily about the fact of producing a physical object. Having said that, as I said, I also think we are missing massive opportunities around the kind of green area. You know, we're starting to see some investment kind of in gigafactories, in kind of electric battery making, in the kind of electric car industry, but it's not fast enough. And we're also missing kind of opportunities along our supply chains. You might know about the Bifab kind of wind farm issue, which was in Scotland, where they're manufacturing wind turbines, and there is a yard which could manufacture those turbines. In fact, the work has gone to Indonesia at lower rates, but not significantly lower rates, because we didn't have a joined up procurement strategy. So I do think there's a lot more that we could be doing to take advantage of kind of new green technology in the UK, and that's maybe where we're really failing to take up those opportunities.
I think actually the TUC has a whole plan. I think I heard one of your people talk about that, to create 400,000 new jobs. And we might actually have a look at that. I think that's very interesting. I think it's an absolute missed opportunity.
Can I come in?
Anyway, sorry, yes, of course, Vicky, yeah.
You can hear me. Suddenly there's a lot of noise around here. Not sure why, but just to say that 400,000 jobs have always been used as what is being promised. I remember 400,000 was in the late 2000s when I was working for the government. I was rung up by someone quite high up, say, we want to make a speech and say that there will be 400,000 new jobs created after the climate change review done by Nick Stern. And I said, well, I can't give you that figure. Those jobs could be additional perhaps, but they could just mean a switch from where you were before, different jobs created. So I can't do. So anyway, the speech was made, 400,000 jobs we mentioned there. And it's been the same. The recent speech from, I think it was Boris Johnson said again 400,000. And so we just don't know how many jobs will be created. And of course, we have to move from where we are now to different types of jobs. And the issue is that when we talk about green manufacturing, that everything we do will be green, or green service provision. Kate was absolutely right to say that services is also producing a product we want. Quite a lot of manufacturing, of course, is now a service centered anyway. So that would be my comment on that. In relation to the big tech firms and the US and whether the US had done it right. And the interesting thing is that the US is seeing exactly the same problem that Kate identified for the UK, which is that average wages have remained pretty flat and have lost out in relation to capital over a period of time. We're now talking about decades and decades where this has been happening. So they haven't achieved anything better by having those big oligopolies, if you like, which are now, running all our systems. So just a word of caution that just having big tech firms doesn't solve your societal problems. There are loads of other questions I've seen being asked, and maybe Andrew wants to answer some of those, then I can come back, and Kate as well.
Shall we just get a couple of other questions from the audience so that we can comment on everything at the same time? Andrew, can you make a quick question, and then Mike Leonard, and then we'll get the panel again. Andrew?
Oh, me?
Yes.
Oh, hi. Good morning,
yes.
Everybody.
You're Andrew, yes. Andrew.
Yes, there are a couple of questions. One's a bit technical, perhaps, but it relates to what the economists call propensity to save and propensity to consume. And my question to Vicky and to Andrew is, what considerations are there that instead of, you've in a sense pointed out the fact that limitations of being able to spend more money on haircuts and things, but isn't there a slightly more serious question about whether you pay or whether you decide to draw down on your huge mountain of consumer debt, which has been hanging over people's heads collectively in this country for a long time? Because surely, if that were to be the case, then if the consumption expansion is supposed to be leading the economic recovery, and people decide to save their money instead of spend it, that rather puts a torpedo through the OBR forecast and indeed Rishi Sunak's budget.
Yeah, and Mike Leonard, I think you have a question, if you're still around.
I am, yeah. Soon and start.
Mike, do you want to put your question? Yeah.
Okay, I can't start my video because the host has blocked it apparently.
I think we can. Joe, can you fix that? I think you have to ask it. I don't know. Anyway, why didn't you ask your question?
Yeah, well, why not? Yeah,
yeah.
Absolutely. That's worked. That's worked now. Good. Yeah. So my question really was that 80% of products that we use to build our homes, and in fact refurbish our homes, which is 39% of the environmental problem, are still made in the UK. But we seem to have a government that doesn't understand that and is actually promoting offshore opportunities. So things like heat pumps, because they don't spend the same amount of money they would on automotive or aerospace to encourage companies to invest in the UK. They're likely to be made offshore. So replace boilers made in the UK with offshore products. And the brick and block industry, which is huge in this country, is under direct threat from the government, who are promoting modern methods of construction with lightweight steel and timbers and that sort of stuff, which are all coming from highly polluting countries, shipped in dirty old ships across the world, as a replacement for our materials. So I just wonder how we get government to understand that, just because it isn't shiny and sexy like aeroplanes and automotive, that the core manufacturing stuff that we do is vital to the UK economy.
Yeah, a great point. Does anyone want to comment on those?
Just and Andrew's point. Yes, I was trying to say it's a difficult question about how much people spend. I mean, when you had building society windfalls for example, there was quite a lot of evidence that people did actually save because it wasn't really affecting their permanent income. And I wouldn't be, I mean, I just think that people are in a position now, and it's not necessarily the people who've got the consumer debt who have got those surpluses. In fact, you'd probably think that a lot of those surpluses are going to be with people who don't need to have much debt anyway. So, but I still think that leaves it as an open question about how much does get spent. And I'd be very surprised. I mean, you know, 10% consumer spending in 1 year would be, I think, unprecedented anywhere, I would have thought. So there must be a question about that. But in a way, you know, if it's 4% 1 year and 4% another year, you know, you get some growth from it anyway. You know, it doesn't. There's one point I think Kate was saying about the 3% cap on public investment. I mean, it's worse than that, because apparently I've discovered this National Infrastructure Commission's mandate from the government, which is fiscal remit is set at between 1 and 1.2% of GDP, which means that the National Infrastructure Commission must be able to demonstrate that its recommendations are consistent with gross public investment in economic infrastructure of between 1 and 1.2% of GDP in each year between 2020 and 2050. So I would suspect that HS whatever has actually fallen foul even more of that. Now, I'm not quite sure, this is an executive agency, but it has been suggested that maybe that's what's done the HS2 in, because how you know, it's the spending won't be till 2030 or whatever, but it's still got this remit. It has to, and it has to do this, I think, for any single project as well as the things overall. Anyway, that's just a point I was quite pleased I found.
Okay, can I come? Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
sure, Vicky, yeah.
No. On the savings side, I think the question is quite correct. I mean, the interesting thing is that the Institute of Fiscal Studies has done some analysis which shows that what's been happening is that indeed people at the higher end, as Andrew was suggesting, are just continuing to save and are being quite careful. People at the lower pay scale are paying back their debts, which is interesting. So they may have been forced to by the banks. One doesn't know, but they seem to be doing so. So the question is indeed what's going to happen to consumer spending. We've seen retail sales go up in October, mainly because people were encouraged to spend more, thinking that Christmas would be cancelled in the sense of no goods available in the shops. So there's a little bit of that. But before that, there was a 5-month decline in retail sales. Yes, of course, people spend money on staycations and so on, but there is a lot of caution around, which is there. And then on Mike's, so indeed, there is a question mark as to how much consumers will spend. And given, as I think Kate was suggesting too, real disposable incomes will be hit in the next year or so, then one wonders what they will do in the next 12 months. But then the question of where do you source your products and what do you substitute UK-made stuff with supposedly cleaner stuff that you bring in from abroad? I think what you absolutely need to do is have a proper carbon price. And until that's done, then we won't be able to take full account of what the carbon cost of the things that we're bringing in from other places is. And I think there needs to be perhaps by industry here in the UK made much clearer to government, to BIS, and to the Treasury. So I think there is big scope for that. And of course, the Europeans are thinking of, the EU is thinking of, and in fact intends to put a carbon adjustment mechanism at the border, so that things that are produced in places where the restrictions aren't as great as perhaps they are here or elsewhere in Europe, then get an extra tariff imposed on them. So those all could be solutions to a problem.
Thanks, Vicky. Great point. I think it's sometime we need to go back to Kate's point about the proportion of the economy that is actually going to workers, because I know the University of Greenwich has done some interesting research on that, proving that it has dropped, I think, in the last couple of decades from 69% to about 61%. And there's some possibility that that where that extra money has gone into private equity, paying dividends and interest payments and things like that. And it will be quite interesting to see if that is true, and if the trend for the US private equity industry really to take over quite a big proportion of UK business which is happening at the moment is actually going to make this worse. It's a big topic, but perhaps we ought to have another session on it. I don't know if the economists have got any quick views on it.
Just really briefly on that, Rod, I would love it if we've just commissioned a bit of work on private equity, because
yeah,
the really interesting thing we hear, like very anecdotally, I've got no sort of proper data on this, is when private equity enters kind of service industries, they often put a cap on the proportion of costs that can go on wages. So we've heard that in the hotel sector very frequently. I heard that in some bits of retail. And I guess we're trying to kind of investigate the extent to which, you know, there are kind of, I guess they're sort of soft norms, I guess, but within the private equity industry, and therefore those changing ownership structures are directly impacting on workers' terms and conditions. So if people have got evidence on that, like, we would love to hear it. We're commissioning a bit of research on it at the moment, but it would be really interesting to see. And there's some very good research that has been done in the US about how the introduction of private equity onto the high street has directly affected workers' terms and conditions. So we'd be really keen on that. I really wanted to pick up Mike's point very quickly around encouraging kind of use of UK businesses. I guess one of the things that I think is a shame about the government sort of dropping its industrial policy kind of ambitions, or even the kind of Industrial Strategy Council, is, again, there were some kind of initiatives which were sort of at least encouraging kind of investment decisions to think about this. So the sector deal with the offshore wind did have a kind of 60% UK content target, basically. And obviously there's kind of competition rules and other structures which can make setting some of those kind of targets difficult. But that was because it was a target, not an injunction. There was at least a kind of push towards thinking about how to invest in the UK supply chain. And you can imagine that the heat and building strategy, which the government has put out, also could have set some kind of ambition or target or structures to suggest that, you know, heat pumps might be manufactured in the UK, or that at least that would be an ambition. But because they've dropped any kind of sense of this is actually an industrial strategy, or any sense of kind of social partnership through which you might have thought about how you'd implement that ambition, that's kind of, those opportunities are kind of being missed, which is, you know, not a helpful answer to your question, I guess, but I think to acknowledge it.
I think there's lots more to discuss. I think we have to bring the Q&A to an end now, and thank the panel very much. We'd normally clap in a physical situation, but anyway, have a virtual clap for a fantastic presentation. Thanks, Vicky. If you want to dash for your plane, do, but we'll be about 2 more minutes. I just wanted to to highlight that we're still in business next year, the Industry Forum, and we've got a lot of things in the pipeline. We're doing quite hopefully big events, which physical events on the dementia pandemic, green hydrogen. We think green hydrogen really deserves much more emphasis in the government strategy. We'd like to get back to a more positive relationship with Europe, and we're talking to a lot of people who think that is both feasible and desirable, and we should work on it. And we also want to go back to the perennial topic of creating enough high quality homes, because that has big economic benefits, social benefits throughout the economy. We're going to look at leveling the economics, if we can get it together, the economics of leveling up. One of our members wants to look at whether proportional representation would actually be better for the economy and better for business. We want to look at digital economies and paying for the NHS. Now, some of those things, we much prefer physical meetings, but we're also going to do some online meetings. We might do some of them quite quickly because we have interest to do pan-European meetings. We work with a number of the embassies, and a lot of our members are actually international companies. And I want to go back and talk to Kate separately about the Green Transition Plan, because I think there are a few more numbers than Vicky believes. And also the impact of private equity, which is going to be so profound, I think, in the UK. We've done some research on that, which we can't go into now. But anyway, thank you so much, panel. I think it's been great. Thank you, Andrew, for making those complex statistics look very simple and very understandable. And thanks to Vicky and Kate for interpreting them. And thanks to a great audience. Okay, that's the end for today.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Right.